Thank you for coming. I'm Marc Jacob. Stephen Case is to my left. And we started studying a couple of years ago. Stephen, many years ago, discovered Peggy's story, just an underappreciated story in American history. In fact, she was probably the most dangerous teenage girl in American history. And half the age of her husband, who was much more famous. And it's a story that nobody really knew. In fact, it just it was poorly understood at the time even, and by the time anyone understood what the story was, nobody seemed to care anymore. Peggy was Mrs. Benedict Arnold, and she liked it that way. She didn't want to be anything else. She would much rather be the victimized wife of a traitor than be considered what the real truth is, which is a co-conspirator to try to bring down the American Revolution, and who had fooled the founding fathers and got off scot-free, which is exactly what she did. All right, about more than a century after her death, British papers in General Clinton's archives are finally studied by American scholars, and they figure out, well, there was all this really important circumstantial evidence that indicate that Peggy Shippen was certainly a part of the plot. And I mean, there's no smoking gun, but there's tons of circumstantial evidence, enough that I think any reasonable person would agree that she knew all about it and was part of the plot. But by that time, she had really kind of gotten a pass from history. And Stephen and I think, wanted to bring this story to another generation and focus the story on Peggy. She's been kind of just a supporting character in a lot of biographies of Benedict Arnold, and we just wanted to center it on her and write it in a different way. You want to start talking about her a little bit, Stephen?
Imagine you were in Damascus, Syria. Not long ago, the violence erupted in distant cities, Aleppo and Home, and it took a while to get to Damascus. And you are a prominent accountant, professional of some kind. What do you do about this war that's suddenly in the capital city where you have achieved prosperity and prominence? Do you support the insurgents? Do you support the government? Or do you just try to say, how do I get through this and come out in one piece with my life and my family intact? Well, that's what the story of Peggy Shippen and her family is, and it's all about Philadelphia from 1774 to shortly before 1780. Peggy's grandfather was a co-founder of what is now Princeton University. Father, extremely prominent lawyer in the community, very wealthy. The family were slave owners. Still reporting in the 1790 census, they had 3 slaves. They have several children. And Marc and I think that the father decided to play the war by being as neutral as he could get away with, leaving no clear message to the children about which side they were on. So, what happens? In 1774, in September, the First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. George Washington of Virginia shows up. Practically the first night he was there, he was invited to dinner at the Shippen home. Peggy met him then for the first time and knew him very well until she had a falling out. And then we get the Declaration of Independence when she's 16, which is literally signed about a block and a half around the corner from the family's fancy home. And then we get to September 1777 and the British.
And the person chosen to be the military governor of the Philadelphia area is Benedict Arnold. Now, by that time, he's had a grievous leg wound that's made him unable to ride a horse and have to ride in a coach, and he's proved himself to be the most audacious and able battlefield commander on the Continental Army side, recognized that way by George Washington. So He's 38 and Peggy is 18 when they marry. They have a courtship of about a year, and this happens. Let me back up just a little bit. Peggy became kind of this society debutante at the age of 16 or 17, shortly after the Declaration of Independence was signed, and the war really started in earnest. They ended up. The British ended up taking Philadelphia and holding it for about 9 months. And during that time, Peggy became very friendly with some of the British officers. They seemed to be a lot more fun than the Patriot officers. There was especially a guy named John Andre who was just this brilliant captain who wrote poetry, played the flute, acted in plays and wrote plays, and spent a lot of time at Peggy's house and became a great friend of hers. But the British ultimately had to leave Philadelphia and go back to New York, and then Arnold comes in, who's really nothing like Andre. Andre is kind of handsome and vibrant, and Arnold by that time is 38 years old and grievously wounded and limping around.
Now, Mark, when the British left, did they do anything special?
They, I don't know what you're talking about, Stephen. No, there was something called, this is another thing, when Steve and I started studying this in earnest, we, with the help of a really brilliant team of academic researchers who Stephen kind of recruited, and they found great documents for us because we couldn't have done it alone. So there was this event called the Mischianza that I certainly had never heard of, and I just wonder why they didn't teach it. It was a big blowout party in Philadelphia in the middle of the occupation of by the British. Meanwhile, this is happens in the spring, just when the terrible winter of Valley Forge is happening. So the Continental Army is in Valley Forge, and the horses are dying, and people are dying, and they're barely surviving. The British are having a great time in Philadelphia, and Peggy is too. So it's the worst time in many people's life, but it's maybe the best in hers. And they had this party called the Mischianza, which cost an incredible amount of money, to where they had 12,000 pounds worth of dresses were sold, which I think convert to pushing $1 million?
Many hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, I mean, there are conversions to modern currency that we use in the book. They're really rough. But, I mean, just some ungodly amount of money. They get these bands floating on barges and go up the Delaware River. They take over the Wharton Mansion because Wharton was a patriot and had to flee. But even the Wharton Mansion wasn't big enough for this party. They built a separate dining hall just for the event. And so, I mean, they're spending millions, incredible amounts of money. John Andre, this dashing officer, is pretty much in charge of designing everything. I mean, he designed what colors the rooms would be and things like that. So it was this absurd little oasis in the middle of this terrible war. So the British leaving Peggy there and disappointed, and Benedict Arnold comes. She's known as the most beautiful woman in Philadelphia, or she's later described as the most beautiful woman in North America. And then later, when she goes into exile in London, spoiler alert there, she too late. But she ends up, she's called the most beautiful woman in England. So she's just very highly regarded, and she doesn't miss a beat as far as going to parties with Benedict Arnold and making sure Benedict Arnold spends a lot of money on parties and on lavish stuff. So Arnold is kind of besieged. You want to get into a little bit of this, why Arnold would have turned traitor?
Well, he was a feisty guy who didn't fit well into groups, and even before the war started, he was in duels with people in the Caribbean. He'd been in the shipping business. And he was serving after the British left as the military commander of Philadelphia. And my candidate for the bad guy in this story is the civilian head of government in Pennsylvania, a man named Joseph Reed, who was exactly the same age. And my judgment, not terribly well supported by the record, but it's a aroma that many things I've read give me, is that when Arnold, a Connecticut man, surfaced in Pennsylvania and married into the richest, most prominent family in town, or one of them, he saw Arnold as a rival for post-war political